All right, welcome back, scholars. We're going to finish up chapter 12, social behavior, and we're talking about social psychology and how there are several factors that influence our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions, and how we're attracted to certain people. So we've talked about, um, you know, first impressions, our first perception, how we develop certain stereotypes based on persons belonging to a particular group. We've also talked about attribution theory and how we make attributions to explain our behavior. And as human beings, we always want to understand why something happened, right? So we'll give attribution to it. If we failed an exam, we might have an internal attribution, which means that we're going to think that it's about us, it's in us, something that we did. And if it's an external attribution for the reason why we failed an exam, then it might be the test was, too difficult, or the professor didn't teach the material well enough. Again, that would be the external. And now we're moving into attraction, and we've talked about companionate love. We talked about passionate love. We've talked about how we are attracted to one another through physical attractiveness. We've talked about similarities. And then we also talked about the reciprocity effect, how we want to be liked by someone who we also like, right? So there's a reciprocity. Okay. So now we're moving into the second part of the attraction piece. There's an evolutionary perspective to attraction, and there are certain physical appearances that is really kind of determinant of our attraction because of, the indication of good health, good genes, and in many cases, high fertility. And so all of this kind of contributes to what we call reproductive potential. And so when we talk about the physical appearance, we look at the physical appearance to determine if those persons are healthy, do they come from a good bloodline? All of those things make a big difference. I joke, but my fiance's mom, right? I look at her mom and I'm like, okay, she continues to still look youthful. She's like almost in her 60s and she still looks youthful. So now I have, something to look forward to. Now I know that my girlfriend, my fiance, comes from good genes and they have pretty good health. Okay. A consistent standards of attraction across culture, we talk about physical appearance, is facial symmetry. So we'll go through some of these examples and I'll show you how facial symmetry is more attractive. We look at the space between the spacing of the eyes. We look at the symmetry of the face, and we look at everything to see if it's symmetrical or not. Does the right side of the face match the left side of the face? The hourglass figure in women is preferred by men. So the waist to hip ratio, that's a ratio from you have a smaller hips versus waist, and it's not too defined, but you do see a kind of an hourglass shape, and that hourglass shape appears to be meaningful to reproductive potential, right? It also signals that women are healthy, they're young, and they are not pregnant, right? So if their waist or their hips, if their waist was bigger than their hips, that could indicate that they might be with child, they might be pregnant, right? But again, that is an indicator of good health in women. And height is reliably rated as desirable in men by women. So they like men that are taller than them, at least taller than them, or again, just tall generally, right? So they want somebody who's 6 foot, or taller, right? So women do prefer men who are taller than them or just tall generally. Okay. So when we talk about gender differences in attraction, you also have to think about preferences in kind of the mating preferences, how they appear across different cultures. And so men across culture usually are going to seek youthfulness. They're going to look at someone who's more physically attractive, and those are both associated with greater reproductive potential, right? And so we think that we're just looking at someone and we're looking at them and they're attractive, right? But there's so many other things that we think about that indicate why we might be attracted to someone. Women, they look at the value ambition. They value social status. financial potential, and all of these are associated with material resources for themselves and their children. They want to be taken care of. They want to make sure that their families are taken care of. So for those who are really attracted to someone who has ambition, motivation, someone who is an achiever, again, they are looking at that in a long term way, right? So if they decide that they want to marry the person or date long term, they're confident that with ambition and social status also comes financial potential, and all of that is associated with being able to provide for their families. Okay? So here's an example or a diagram for the waist to hip ratio, right? So this, when you rate a physical attractiveness, there was a study that showed that they used the same model. Okay, they used the same model, and all they did was modify their waist to hip ratios. And on average, the middle model was identified as being more attractive. They rated them on a scale from 0 to 10, and they rated the middle model as being more attractive than any other, right? So those who have a waist to hip ratio of greater than 0.7, again, are less attractive. Those who have less than 0.07 might be not as attractive. And so we have those individuals wearing those corsets, and they take their waist in way too much. It doesn't look all that natural. And so you do want to, again, have slimmer hips, slimmer waist. But again, this is shown to be one of the most attractive rates with waist to hip ratios. And again, for those who are looking at height, for women, they prefer, and that's more desirable trait for women. And they like, broad shoulders, hips, small hips, waist, and height for desirable traits in women. Okay, so here we're looking at Beyonce, right? We're looking at the left side of her face here and the right side, and you can look at her face, and her face looks pretty symmetrical. Aside from maybe a lip here, right? But you can see that her face is pretty much symmetrical. Her teeth are even pretty symmetrical. They look pretty much the same. Her eyes are, spaced kind of evenly apart. Eyebrows are equal distance apart. There's a slight difference here, but again, she looks, her face looks pretty much symmetrical, right? So we're going to look at this image. This image is both of her faces together, right? Her right side, so if we go back, this is her right side, and then you go right and right. So you just superimpose them together, and you look, and it looks almost exactly the same as if the right and the left, right? You don't see much of a difference. So her attractiveness is based on the symmetry of her face. So she has a lot of facial symmetry. And so you talk about some of those individuals who, movie stars, artists who are really attractive, people find really attractive, maybe the sexiest man in the world, right? Those are the individuals who have high facial symmetry, and their bodies are symmetrical, right? You want your body to be symmetrical. You want your left arm and your right arm to be the same length. You want the musculature in your arms to be the same size, right? So everything in symmetry is considered to be more attractive. This is just an idea of age, right? We talk about, looking for youthfulness, and looking for status, and financial potential. Both of these couples, right? 81 and 47, they got married. Robert Kraft is the owner of the New England Patriots, billionaire, business owner, and his wife Diana, Bloomberg. She's a physician, but again, she's a lot younger than he is. But again, that financial potential, the social status, all of those things, she knows that she has someone that can take care of her and children. Okay, Diddy and Young Miami, right? He's 53, she's 28. They're still together, but again, he has that financial potential. He could take care of her children. Again, and he has a youthfulness to himself anyway. But again, that's what women look for. They look oftentimes they're interested in older men because of that social status. Sometimes even the maturity level of the men, because again, women do sometimes mature faster than men do emotionally in a way. Okay. And these are some things to think about. We do this in class, but we all have similar uh, traits and traits that we find people attractive, right? We can make a list, and if we made a list, maybe 5 to 10 traits, and we compare that list to everybody in the classroom, we'd see some commonality in the things that we find attractive on people. Maybe the personality, maybe the way they carry themselves, maybe the physical characteristics. We look at certain people, and we have similar characteristics that we both all agree on. Okay. So how do we form attitudes, right? How do we form attitudes? We talked about, attractiveness. We talked about first impressions, but how do we form attitudes of people, right? Why do we form attitudes? Why do we make social judgments? And, part of that is survival, right? We have attitudes about things so that we like the things we like because they are and have been beneficial, may serve as being beneficial to us. And we don't like certain things because they aren't, right? We have certain preferences. All of us have different preferences, and we have attitudes about certain things just based on our lived experiences and how we maybe how we were raised, our culture, or our family dynamic. All of those kind of influence our attitudes and how we make social judgments. Attitudes are positive or negative evaluations of objects of thought, right? You could have attitudes about social groups. You can have attitudes about institutions, consumer products, people, right? Many of us, if you are more of a liberal individual, then, your attitude about Donald Trump might be different than someone who is more conservative. Consumer products, do you prefer Pepsi or Coke? Do you prefer Wendy's or Burger King? What types of foods do you enjoy? Right? All of those are attitudes about specific foods, food groups and consumer products, right? Social issues. Do you agree with, abortion, or are you against gun safety? Right? All of those things are really, really important, right? So we can think about the attitudes that we have. And those attitudes then also include a cognitive, an affective, and a behavioral component. The cognitive component, those are our beliefs about a particular, object of an attitude, right? So we'll look through an example. The affective is the emotional feeling, being stimulated by an object of thought. And then lastly, behavioral, right? So how do we act in certain ways based on our cognitive and our affective component of our attitudes, right? So do we vote in a certain way because we don't like a certain person? Do we, go to a certain restaurant because we enjoy the food and we like the food? I love Mexican food, right? So my belief about Mexican food is it's very, very delicious. It gives me, good feelings. And then I go to Mexican restaurants. More often than not, I'm going to choose a Mexican restaurant before I choose any other restaurant, just because I love and have a positive attitude about Mexican food. So again, here is an example. Okay, this is your attitude on gun control. Okay, so this is an attitude again, and we're going to talk about those 3 components and how they kind of meet together or are kind of combined to give us what we do. Okay, so the cognitive components, those are our beliefs and our attitudes. Here's an example. It says gun owners end up shooting themselves more often than they shoot things. Right. So again, attitude on gun control. This is one of my attitudes. This is kind of the belief I have about guns. The affective component. It says guns make me sick. Right. So they don't like guns whatsoever. Right. It's an emotion. It's a feeling they have. And then the last piece, the behavioral. Right. Predisposition to act. They vote for gun control advocates whenever possible. Right. So if they have a candidate that's running for office, they're going to vote for the gun control advocate versus the gun control lessening the gun control restrictions, right? So again, you have your cognitive, your belief, the emotions, and then your emotions lead to your behavior. Okay, attitudes vary in your dimensions based on strength, your accessibility to it, and your ambivalence. Okay, so when we talk about the strength of an attitude, this is generally viewed as are they firmly held or are they not firmly held, right? So if you have a really firmly held belief, it's going to be really, really hard to change your attitude, right? So if you are against if you are for gun control and you don't like guns, it's going to be very hard to convince you otherwise, Right? You're going to vote in the same way. You're going to have the same feelings. Your behavior is going to be very, very similar because, again, you have a strong attitude against it, right? The accessibility, right? We see guns all the time in media. There's always shootings. There's always crime involving guns. So our attitude, again, refers to how often one thinks about it, right? We're probably going to think more about gun control because we see it in the news so often, right? We're going to think about certain social issues because we see it on the news so often. Different consumer products, right? Do you see, Toyota and Kia and BMW in your that you see them more often on TV, right? So you're going to have different attitudes about, those particular brands of cars just based on the accessibility. And then the last thing is the ambivalent attitudes. These are conflicting evaluations that include both positive and negative feelings about an object of thought. So you may be against gun control. I mean, you may be against or for gun control, but you also might be for your own safety. So you might have a gun, right? Protect yourself, but you're against some of the other policies and procedures that are in place to lessen the gun restriction laws, right? So that's a positive and a negative feeling against it because you think guns can help protect you, but you also don't like everyone having a gun, right? Smoking is another one, right? You smoke, though you know smoking can be bad for you and can lead to other diseases like cancer and hypertension and diabetes, right? You know those things, but you continue to smoke. And again, that's kind of an ambivalent attitude, right? When we think about attitudes and how they predict behavior, the strength of your attitude and, kind of the situational constraints oftentimes are more or better determinants of how you're going to behave. So just because you have an attitude about something doesn't necessarily mean you're going to actually behave in that same way, right? So it says attitudes are mediocre predictors of behavior, right? So here's an example of meta-analysis that was done of 797 attitude behavior studies, and they found that the average correlation between attitudes and behavior was 41%. Okay, so what that means is it does explain some of the behavior that we do, right? So our attitudes do explain some of the behavior, right? So if we were to square this, point 0.17, so 17%. So this means that 17% of the variance is explained in our behaviors is explained by our attitudes, right? So that means that there's another 83% that explains that helps to explain the variance in how I move and my behaviors that I right? So I still have some other explanation outside of just my attitudes that may explain why I behave in a certain way. We also fail to factor in the influence of attitude strength. So again, our strength of our attitudes play a big role in what we do and how we behave. So if I'm really, really against, restrictions, the lessening of restrictions of gun laws, then I'm going to vote. I'm always going to vote the same way because of the strength of the attitude. And then situational constraints plays a big role as well, right? So if you think about it, my attitudes against marijuana, I may not be for marijuana, right? But say I'm in my college dorm room, my friends are, playing the game and somebody lights up and they're passing a joint around me, right? I may not say anything at all because it's a situation. I don't want to come off as, a square. I don't want to come off as being, the mom of the group. And so I don't say anything at all. But say the next day we're in class and we're having a discussion about marijuana. And I don't mind speaking about marijuana because I don't believe that, it should be legal, right? So those are attitudes that are kind of changing based on the situation, right? So the behavior does change, again, based on, where we are, our situation, and we make certain decisions based on our behavior and different social constraints. Okay? When we talk about attitudes are broken up into our explicit attitudes and our implicit attitudes, and both of them do influence our behavior in marketed ways, right? So explicit attitudes are those attitudes that one holds consciously and can readily describe, right? The implicit attitudes are those covert attitudes that are expressed in subtle automatic responses over which one has little conscious control, right? So the explicit attitudes, I love um, Chipotle, or I love Mexican food, right? The other piece is implicit, right? Those things that are kind of outside of my control, they're kind of, you know, kind of in the unconscious, they kind of happen automatically. So these are negative ideas or stereotypes can seep into one's subconscious mind, and then they contaminate one's reaction to people, right? So I might be against and condemn prejudice, right, against a certain race or ethnicity, but I unknowingly harbor these implicit attitudes that reflect subtle forms of prejudice, right? So, for example, I'm a very fit individual, and I might, like I might value everybody, right? I might value everyone. Everybody's valuable. Everybody's important. But deep down on the inside, right, when I look at those who might be less fit than me, who might be obese, I might harbor some implicit attitudes against them. I might, treat them very differently than somebody who is or looks like me, more fit, right? So I have these implicit attitudes. Or, religion, right? Those who don't practice the same religion as me, right? I think that all religions are important, but for those who don't practice Christianity, I might have this implicit attitude against them and treat them very different. Kind of a subtle, kind of expressed subtle, response. But it's subconscious and it's in my unconscious. I don't really even realize I'm doing it. Right. A lot of individuals white individuals who say that they aren't prejudiced, sometimes they do practice discriminatory, subtle discriminations, the microaggressions against people of color or minority POCs. And again, it happens. It's a subtle thing, and we need to be able to call those things out. We need to be able to identify it, call it out, so that we can kind of address it in a more positive and effective way. Okay. One way that we measure implicit attitudes is through the implicit attitude test, association test, excuse me, IAT. We use several methods, but again, this is the most widely used. Harvard has this online, it's an online activity where you take this test, and I'll show you an example next. But you take this test and you associate. So, say you wanted to take an implicit attitude test for Black and white people, right? So, in the first test, in the first round of the test, you have Black names and you have negative words, and you have white names, you have positive words. Okay, that's the first test, and you press on the left hand side of the key. You press for Black and good, and you press for white and positive on the right hand side, right? And then the next, you flip it, right? So now you have Black faces, and then you have positive words, white faces, negative words, and you're looking at the reaction time. That reaction time is telling you if you have an individual who responds really, really quickly to Black faces and negative words, they probably harbor some implicit attitudes versus against Black people. Versus, if you have someone who's really, really quick on the draw with, white words, white faces, and positive words, then you see that you're favoring your in group, and you're not favoring your out group. Okay. The implicit attitude or association test has shown that 80% of the respondents show negative implicit attitudes about the elders. Right. We might, respect our elders and think they're really valuable to our communities, but we may hold this negative implicit attitude against them. Right. 75% of white respondents exhibit implicit prejudice against Blacks. It says implicit prejudice against homosexual persons, the disabled, and the obese are also very, very common. So even though we might be really, really welcoming and inclusive in our environments, we also may have these implicit attitudes that do show themselves in how we associate with different groups. So here's an example. Again, on the left-hand side, you have white or bad, Black or good, right? Or in this right-hand case, Black or bad, white or good. And so you're clicking, right, to show the implicit prejudice against Blacks, right? So those who have an implicit prejudice against Black people, they are going to click the mouse a lot faster, or the keyboard a lot faster when they see in this instance than in this instance. So they would have a slower reaction time in clicking the button for black and good versus black or bad. And this is for white individuals, right? And again, it's just implicit. It's kind of those unconscious things that we don't think about. It doesn't mean that they are, explicitly racist or explicitly prejudiced, but they do have these subtle behaviors and responses to people who do not look like them. And again, it's a natural thing that we do. But once you know that you do have these implicit biases, it's important that you know it so that you can address it again in a really effective way, so that you kind of reduce the amount of those subtle responses, those prejudiced responses that we do have against certain groups of people. Okay? Higher implicit racism scores in white subjects were associated with decreased smiling, reduced eye contact, and shorter speaking time in interracial reactions, right? So very, very subtle. Like we won't know, right? We won't know that they're not smiling as much or that they, have reduced their eye contact. But hey, think about it. Interact with someone of the opposite, from someone who is white. See if you can kind of see those subtle differences. Implicit prejudice also predicts discrimination in hiring, right? Negative attitudes about immigration and aggression in response to provocation, right? So white people may be more aggressive when they have a dispute with someone of another ethnicity versus someone who might be white. They might not treat someone as harshly if they get cut off in traffic, right? Discrimination in hiring, right? We're going to hire those who look more like us and have negative attitudes about those who don't. And the last point says beyond the realm of prejudice, implicit attitudes about math predict interest and performance in math. And implicit attitudes about potential political candidates predict our voting behavior. So if we have these implicit attitudes against a white candidate or a black candidate, our voting behavior will be different based on those. So how do we change our attitudes, right? Once we know that we have an attitude against or for or against something, how do we change them, right? It's not always easy to change other people's attitudes, right? It's going to take some really internal work for them to be able to change their own attitudes. But again, it doesn't stop us from trying to, right? We try to persuade people to change their attitudes. We try to give them data against what, some of the confirmations that they've had, the stereotypes that they formed. We try to give them data against those stereotypes. But again, it's really, really hard to change the attitude of someone who's already just formed it. It's kind of ingrained in who they are, right? So 4 sets of variables influence persuasion, and that's trying to persuade someone to change their attitude. You have a source, you have the message itself, you have the channel, so who's telling it, and then you have the receiver. The receiver is the person that you're trying to change. So when we're talking about the source is the source credible? Do they have any expertise in it? Do they have any trustworthiness? Are they likable? Do they have some type of attractiveness? Are they similar to me? Right? Do they look like me? Right? And then the what? Is it, do they make some strong arguments? Do they have repetition in how they speak? Is it kind of a fear appeal versus logic, right? Are they trying to scare me versus giving me some kind of logical appeal to why I should or should not vote a certain, right? When we talk about the channel, is it in person? Are they telling me in person? Are they on television or radio? Is it audio tape, video via computer, right? When I'm thinking about believing something, right? If you believe in a particular religion, right, and you go to church, right? Is your pastor or the speaker a credible speaker, right? Do they have a strong argument, right? Is it in person or is it online? Is it on television? When we were in COVID, we had to look at a lot of our television, and a lot of we had to go to church online, right? YouTube and Facebook, right? And then the receiver. What is the receiver's personality? Are they extremely skeptical? Are they really neurotic? Are they really irritable? Right? Are they agreeable or not agreeable? If they're really agreeable, then it might be a little easier for them to be persuaded. Right? What is their initial attitude on the issue? Right? If I'm against guns and you're trying to persuade me that we should open up the gun laws, if my attitude is already strong and my initial attitude is against them, it's going to be really difficult for me to change. Right? But again, we have to identify each of these different components and variables in order to see how we can influence somebody to change their attitude about something. Okay. So it says, which of the following is a receiver factor? And you can go back a little bit to look at those different influencers, those different factors. But it says, which of the following is a receiver factor that influences the source's ability to persuade, right? So it says appeal based on fear, A, B, the way the message was transmitted, C, likability and attractiveness, and D, initial attitude on the issue, right? If you go back, you'll see that the answer should be D, right? So the initial attitude on the issue, that's the receiver, that's the person who you're trying to persuade. Again, their initial attitude plays a big role. So it says studies that show that the stronger attitudes are more resistant to change. Stronger attitudes are tougher to alter because they tend to be embedded in networks of beliefs, their value system, and the resistance can, again, promote further resistance. Okay? So how do we form our attitudes, right? One of the ways that we form our attitudes is through learning, right? We learn through our environment by growing up in certain environments, in certain situations, evaluative conditioning, right? That means we have famous people who are telling us what to do. We have maybe our favorite person, the most popular person in school is telling us to wear these shoes or to eat this food, to go to this party. And so we make these attitudes and have these attitudes about people and things and events based on, we're making evaluation based on things that we see in our environment. Operant conditioning, right? So your attitudes is reinforced by other people. That means, my family, I'm against, abortion. My family's against abortion, and they reinforce, my attitude against abortion or for abortion, right? Whatever our beliefs are. My family is against guns, and so, I'm against guns because my attitude is reinforced. Okay. I go to a particular bar or restaurant because I'm reinforced. I love that bar or restaurant because my friends and I go there and we all love it. We're all reinforcing one another to go to a certain or patronize a certain bar. And then observational learning, right? Your parents' political beliefs become yours oftentimes, right? If your parents are more liberal, then the likelihood that you're going to be liberal is the likelihood is high, right? If your parents attend a certain church or a certain religion beliefs, you're going to, again, they're going to become yours because you have observed them in your belief system, right? If people around you are wearing Jordans, are wearing the latest shoes or latest clothing, you're likely going to wear them and buy them because, again, people are wearing them around you. Again, that happens all the time. That's why many of us are going to be wearing the same shoes because, again, we observe and our attitudes about a certain brand are based on our observation with the people around us. Right? When we talk about identifying our attitudes, okay, our attitudes and our beliefs oftentimes may change, right? There's what we call a dissonance theory to our behavior and our attitudes. And dissonance theory was coined by Leon Festinger back in 1957. And he said that the dissonance theory is what we call an inconsistency among our attitudes, and it propels people in the direction of attitude change, right? So if I have an attitude about smoking, right, and I know that smoking is bad for my health, I'm more likely to change my attitude about smoking that it's bad. And so my behavior will also change along with it, right? So cognitive dissonance is that psychological state that exists when related attitudes or beliefs contradict one another. And that contradiction creates this tension, this anxiety in us, right? So people who have this tension, this cognitive dissonance, they tend to try to relieve this tension in very various ways. They either try to reject, whatever that belief is. They try to explain it away, try to rationalize their belief, or they try to avoid new information that is against it, right? So instead of, I know that, smoking is bad, but I continue to smoke. I don't look at news that's telling me that smoking is bad. I don't look at or read any articles that's anything related to smoking because I know that it's gonna be against what I believe. Okay. Cognitive dissonance, again, is more intense when people hold many dissonant views, right? and those views are more important. If I am a strong proponent against guns, then again, it's going to be really, really hard for me to change my attitude, right? But even if I own a gun, right, there is some tension there, right? There is some tension there. And so we have to be mindful of that as we begin to form our attitudes and how our attitudes are essentially formed. Some examples of cognitive dissonance, right? Smoking, right? Again, we smoke, yet we know smoking is bad, right? Eating meat, right? We eat meat and we love animals, right? Those are two contradictory attitudes. We love animals, but we eat meat, and so there's this tension there, right? But we just continue to eat meat and rationalize it away because we're not eating the meat that we see, right? We're not eating, you know, we're not related to the chicken, right? We don't have chickens in our backyard. We don't have cows in our backyard. So since they're further away from us, they're not that important. Then we can eat, right? Doing household chores, right? Somebody, we believe in equality, right? Of all, like we want to eliminate the hierarchy and gender differences in household chores. Yet we feel like our wife should do certain things, right? They should, they should wash the dishes, they should iron the clothes, they should do the laundry, right? We view women inequally, but we again ascribe that our wife should do certain household chores, right? Supporting fast fashion, right? We're against certain labor laws, right? We're against the treatment that those people in those fast factories get. Like they're getting underpaid, they're overworked, the working conditions are they suck, right? Yet we still buy the clothing, we still buy the cheaper clothing, we still buy the discounted and the consignment clothing. Again, that's contradictory, right? They're related; those beliefs do contradict, right? And then the last thing we talk about when we talk about attitude formation is effort justification, right? So when people work to justify their efforts that have not panned out. So sometimes, you come to love what you suffer to achieve, right? So this is like, hey, I'm in school, I don't really like it, but I'm going to continue to work extremely hard to achieve it, even though I don't like it, because it's going to work out in the end, right? I don't like studying, but I know that I have to study so that I can get the grades that I want, right? So again, there's this effort justification. I'm justifying my effort based on what I know I want to achieve in the future. Okay. All right. Okay. So again, we're going back to thinking about persuasion. How do I persuade? How do I persuade someone? There are two ways that we can persuade, right? There's what we call a central route and a peripheral route, right? The central route in elaboration, right? We talk about Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, right? They have this elaboration route, and there are two basic routes. The central route, people carefully ponder the content and logic of persuasive messages, right? And then the peripheral route, persuasion depends on non-message factors such as attractiveness and credibility of the source, right? Attitude change through the central route again it's more effective, right? When we're looking at the logic and the content, that's more persuasive than if we're just looking at somebody who's more attractive and maybe they're more credible, right? But again, attitudes change through the central route. These are a little more enduring. They are a little more resistant to change, and they predict our behavior a lot better than the peripheral route. So if you think about it, for example, we have a political candidate who is running on these certain aims, and he has these certain goals that he wants to achieve once he gets into office, right? He's speaking at a town hall or he's speaking at on a debate, right? One of the speakers comes up and he's spitting facts. His content is really really solid. His logic is amazing, and he's not really all that fan. He doesn't have all that fanfare, right? But he is a credible source, right? While the other one comes out, he brings out his music. He has these sparklers that he comes out with, and all this fanfare. He has a video, and he has all this stuff, and he's making himself look more attractive than he actually is. right? Those candidates who come in with the facts, they come in with, content and solid logic, they're oftentimes going to be able to persuade you more than that person who is just really has all this fanfare and fireworks, videos, music, all these different slogans. It's really about the content, especially when individuals are looking at what they should believe, right? What kind of attitude they should have about something. Okay. All right. So that's attitudes, right? We form our attitudes based on certain things, right? So conformity and obedience. Now we're going to talk about uh, how we're affected by the groups around us, right? Do we conform? Don't we conform? And we're going to talk about several studies that identify conforming to certain groups based on certain factors. Then we'll also go into obedience. Why do we obey? Why don't we obey? And why do we yield to kind of the power of the others around us? Okay? So what is conformity? Conformity is just our tendency to yield to real or imagined social pressure, right? So when you were a young child and you saw everybody in your school wearing a certain clothing style, back in the day it was polo or Tommy Hilfiger. I want to be like everybody else. Everybody else is wearing Tommy Hilfiger. You're going to tell your parent to go buy Tommy Hilfiger, right? Because everyone else is, right? It's a social pressure, right? Your friends are all going to the movies on Saturday, right? And so you're like, well, since everybody else is going to the movies, I want to go to the movies. Can I go to the movies, Mom? Right? So those are the questions that we ask, okay? Because of that social pressure. People tend to conform in certain situations based on certain characteristics. Solomon Asch is an individual who studied conformity, and we'll talk about some of them, right? So group size and group unanimity, those are key determinants of conformity. So group size, the larger the group, the more you're going to be willing to conform. And then if more people are choosing a certain way, you're likely to choose that way as well, right? If again, especially if the group size is large, if everybody's choosing to go to Taco Bell and you want to go to Burger King initially, right? But if you got 10 friends who are going to Taco Bell, you're likely going to go ahead and conform to the group, right? The normative influence, right? This is an effect that promotes conformity to social norms for fear of negative social consequences, right? So you're in a group, y'all going to, gonna go, go to the amusement park, right? You want to go to the Six Flags, but everybody else wants to go to Disney World, right? You feel pressured to go to Six Flags, right? I mean, you feel pressure to go to Disney World because everybody else is going. If you don't go, you're gonna be ostracized, right? You might not be friends with them if you don't go, right? Or peer pressure, right? Person may feel pressure to smoke because all their friends are smoking, right? And they don't turn it down because if they turn it down, then they seem lame, right? That's what we call a normative influence. It's the norm. We have to go with the norm because if we go against the norm, then there might be negative social consequences. As we think, they might joke on us, they might talk about us the next day at school. So we go ahead and smoke so that we go along with the norm. Informational influence, right? So this is an effect that often contributes to conformity in which people look to others for guidance on how to behave in ambiguous situations, right? So I'm in a restaurant and it's a really fancy restaurant. We have all these different silverware. You got the 3 different types of forks. You got the salad fork, the entree fork, you got the dessert fork. Then you got all these different types of spoons. What do you use for? You got different types of plates on the table, right? So now you're looking around to see what other people are doing so that you can go ahead and conform to the group. If you walk into a library for the first time and you don't know that the norm is for everyone to be quiet, then you look around and you see that everybody's just kind of focused in on their work. And so you focus in on your own work, you're conforming just based on the information that you're receiving from the environment. So Solomon Asch did an experiment, right? And that's the reason why we know and determine, how these things work, right? Because of some of the experiments that have been done, right? So Solomon Asch experimented with investigating the extent to which social pressure from a majority group, so group size and unanimity, could affect a person to conform. So what he did was he took 50 male students from Swarthmore College in USA, and they did what we call a vision test. And I'll show you a diagram on the next slide. It was actually what a line test. It was a line judgment test. And what they were asking the participants to do is look at the target line, and then there are going to be 3 other lines on the other side, and they're looking to see if the target line matched the length of any of the other 3 lines on the test line, right? So using the judgment task, Ash put a naive participant in a room filled with 7 other Confederates or actors, right? So this naive participant went in, he was thinking that everybody else is a participant, right? He thought that everybody else was a participant just like him, right? Everybody else was, coming right off the street, didn't know what was going on, right? So he devised this experiment where he gave everybody 18 different trials, right? It was 18 trials. And what he did was he had all of the 7 Confederates, they agreed on, when they would agree and when they wouldn't agree on the line judgment task, right? So it says if a person gave an incorrect answer, it would be clear that, again, this was due to group pressure. So everybody answered a certain way, right? And then they obviously they answered the wrong question because they wanted to see if somebody would answer wrong and go with the group, right? So the obvious answer was there, right? You had the line task here on the target, and then you saw the 3, right? And so if all the Confederates they answered wrong, and then the participant also answered wrong, that would say that, okay, he conformed to the group. Okay. So here's the example, right? So you see here's the standard line, the target line. He would ask everybody in there, and the naive participant would sit at the end, right? So he'd be the last person to answer. He'd be the 8th person to answer. You'd have participant 1 through 7, they would all answer, and say he asked them, so which line excuse me, is the same length as the standard line? And these are all the comparison lines. In the experiment, out of the 12 trials or 18 trials, 12 of them, they would answer wrong, right? So they would have said 1. Everybody from 1 to 7 would have chose 1, right? And then they would have got to answer the 8th participant, which was the actual participant, and he would ask them which one matches the line. If they answered 1 when the actual answer would have been 2, then that means they conformed with the group. And he did this over the course of time, right? So 18 trials, and out of those 18 trials, 12 of those trials was when he forced everybody to answer wrong, right? And he wanted to see if the participant would either answer wrong or right at least one time, right? And if they did it at least one time, that means that they conformed to the group, right? So we see there, right? So the actual correct line is 2, right? That matches the standard line, right? So again, when we go through this experiment, we do see 9 times out of 10, right? At least one time they're going to answer and go along with the crowd, right? Because of the social conformity phenomenon. Right? So here are the results, right? Ash measured the number of times each participant conformed to the majority view, and on average, about 1/3 of the participants who were placed in the situation went along and conformed with clearly incorrect majority on the critical trial. So a third of people, right, went along with it, right? Over the 12 critical trials, and those critical trials were when everybody in the group chose the wrong answer, right? About 75% of the participants conformed at least once, and 25% of the participants never conformed at all, right? So you have some people who are just headstrong and they don't conform, but we have different personalities. You have individuals who are more agreeable, and if they're more agreeable, then they may just go ahead and go along with the group. But if they're less agreeable, then they're gonna go along with their gut each time. They're not gonna go along with it, right? So that the personality and your personality type has a lot to do with how much you conform to certain groups or not. Right? In the control group, with no pressure to conform to Confederates, less than 1% of the participants gave the wrong answer. So you see that, again, conformity does happen, no matter who you are, but again, your personality does play a big role because, again, a third of the participants, they did go along and answered the incorrect answer. Right? The second half of this is we talk about obedience. And the Milgram study was looking to see if individuals would do something that was detrimental to someone else's health just based on having an authority figure around them, right? And this was a study that was kind of inspired by some of the things that happened um, in the Nazi camps, right? You had soldiers, you had concentration camps where people were being killed by people just because of their beliefs, right? And they wanted to see if this was actually something that would happen. Do and can individuals be brainwashed to obey something and harm someone or kill someone just based on someone telling them to do it, right? And what they wanted to do was it's a learning experiment, right? They wanted to see if, again, do you obey and what is your tendency to obey authority figures? But what what really got this experiment to be really, really groundbreaking is they used deception to determine kind of how that worked, right? So here are some of the concepts behind it. So initially they marketed they marketed this experiment as a learning experiment, right? So they said that if the accomplice made any mistakes that necessitated shocks, the teacher was instructed to increase the shock after each wrong answer. So you had a teacher and you had a learner. And then you had in the teacher's room, then you had a lab person, right? And so they were monitoring the teacher, right? So every time the learner got an answer wrong, right, they'd ask him a question, the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was then instructed to apply a shock as a punishment for getting the wrong answer, right? And then each wrong answer, they increased the shock, right? They increased the shock each time. And the teacher thought that they were actually giving the person a shock. It actually was a phantom shock, but in this experiment, the only person who was the participant, the actual participant, was the teacher. The lab coat or the person who was monitoring and the learner were both Confederates. They were actors, right? So every time they would give the person a shock, the person would yell and scream or protest because of the pain that they were experiencing because of the shock. And then the individual who was monitoring the experiment, person in the white coat, would tell the teacher, "Oh, give him another shot. He got the answer wrong." Right? Milgram replied that by pointing out that so do soldiers and bureaucrats in the real world. Does this happen? Right? Can you do villainous acts performed in obedience to authority? And what they were able to show was they actually were, right? So individuals in the experiment group, right, they were given these shocks, right? Even though they heard the individual protesting in agony and pain, they would continue to give the shocks because there was an authority figure standing in the room with them, encouraging them to keep giving the shocks, right? So even though they voiced and displayed distress about harming the learner, right? So the teacher, the participant, they're like, "I don't want to do this." 65% of the participants administered all 30 levels of that shock, right? And again, here, the levels of the shock, they go from slight shock all the way up through to death, right? So the voltage goes very, very low to very, very high. And people were giving all 30 of those shocks, no matter what, right? So Milgram argued that strong pressure from an authority figure, right, can make decent people do indecent things to others, right? So the very fact that, this person right here, this white lab coat was telling him, go ahead and give him that shot. Go ahead and give him that shot. They continued to give it up to, again, 30, 65% of the participants. That's a great majority of the people. So people, again, in the pressure of an authority figure, can and will do things that are decent or undecent to other people, right? It just happens. And again, in our situation, we were asked, would we administer all the shocks? Many of us would say no, right? Because we value the person on the other side, right? But some of us, given the deception that was given in this experiment, we may go all the way through, just depending on, uh, our attitudes, our beliefs, that would influence how we behave and how we obey authority figures. Conformity and obedience is not unique to American culture, right? These replications have been done across various industrialized nations, and the replications has been shown to occur. 65%. It's around there, right? Replications of the ass experiment have found somewhat higher levels of conformity in collectivist cultures, right, than individualistic cultures, right? Why would that be the case, right? People are oftentimes going to go along with the crowd because they view their social setting and their environment and their community as really, really, really important to them. So they would likely go along with the crowd than not, right? Us being more individualistic, we'd less likely to answer incorrectly, even if everybody else answered the question the same way. We're going to look at it and say, no, that's not right. And you would answer the correct answer, right? But again, each of these, you talk about cultural differences, again, very not unique at all, right? This is a human thing that we all deal with. Okay. So the last unit we'll talk about is behavior in groups, right? How do we behave? Why do we behave certain ways in particular groups, right? It's the behavior alone versus behavior in groups. How does that affect us? Does our behavior while we're alone differ than what we do when we're in a group? So group is any two or more individuals who interact and are independent, right? So some of the different phenomena that have been studied about groups and the effectiveness of groups in behavior is one of them is called the bystander effect, right? The bystander effect is a phenomenon where people are less likely to provide needed help when they are in groups than when they are alone, right? There was a study that was done shown where if you are in a crowd, right? If you're in a crowd and you see somebody who is hurt, you're less likely to help that person, especially if you're in a larger crowd, because you think, okay, somebody else will do it, right? Somebody else will do it. I don't have to do it, right? However, if you're by yourself, maybe one or two people, and you see someone who needs help, you're likely to go help, right? Because again, now I'm responsible if I don't go help, right? But if there are a larger group around me, then I'm less likely to help because, again, somebody else will do it, right? So the probability of getting help declines as group size increases, right? So as you increase the number of people, the amount of help that somebody might give decreases. But when you decrease it, then the likelihood of the probability of getting help is increased. So if you're hurt in a big crowd, you need to be yelling really, really loudly, right? Because the likelihood that you're going to get help decreases. If you're in a less crowded room, then you're likely to get help. Okay. Diffusion of responsibility occurs in a group situation, like I talked about before. It's not my responsibility, or I don't feel as much responsible if I have, 50 people around me and somebody's hurt, right? Whereas if I was the only person in the room, or only had two people in the room with me, then the diffusion of responsibility, I take on more responsibility because I can't diffuse it to other people around. Okay. When we talk about groups and how we behave in groups, we also have to talk about productivity and efficiency as well, right? So group productivity and social loafing, right? What is social loafing? Social loafing is kind of a reduction in effort by individuals when they work in groups as compared to when they work by themselves, right? So this happens a lot when we're doing group projects, right? I like group projects if I'm in a pretty decent group, right? I don't like them if I have people who kind of diffuse their responsibility and don't work, right? But social loafing and bystander effect appear to share some common characteristics, and one of them is the diffusion of responsibility in groups, right? So if I have a large group and we have a task that we must complete, the likelihood that it's going to get done in a timely fashion decreases because of the diffusion of the responsibility. I do less work because everyone else around me is doing less work, right? Or I think that everybody else is going to pick up the slack, right? Social loafing is not inevitable, right? So the smaller and the more cohesive the group is, the higher your productivity, right? When we have a newly formed group, social loafing is probably less prevalent. When you have contributions that are identifiable, I know specifically who's supposed to do what, and I know that my contributions, my productivity is going to be monitored, then I'm probably gonna behave in a different way and have higher level of productivity. And then in collectivist cultures, right? I put more stock in my group. I want the group to be successful, and so my productivity continues to go up, right? So as your group size goes up, right? We have reduced effort. This reduced effort, that's the first piece, right? Right. We reduce the effort because of the diffusion of responsibility. Right. I feel like everybody else is going to pick up some of the slack. Right. So this graph comes from a study that was done where they asked participants to um, make a lot of noise, right? Clap and yell um, to to support someone, right? And so they had them do it by themselves, okay? And with one person, this is potential productivity, right? But when you add two people, their clapping and their loudness, the sound pressure began to decrease. And then when you add six people, each individual person, they decrease their production of sound, right? So this is what we call a pseudo group. So they had people blindfolded and they had earmuffs, and they told them, make sounds if you were doing it by yourself. And then now you're in a group with two people. Now you're in a group with six people, and gradually each time their sound pressure that they produced decreased. When they did it in actual groups, they had people be able to see the number of people in their group. When they did a group with two, it was what we call a loss of coordination, right? So now we're overlapping in our amount of work that we do, right? So it's just like when you have someone, for example, a yearbook team, right? You don't really delineate who does what, and so you have a lot of people who are they're kind of overlapping their efforts, right? And when you have that happen, then the productivity goes down, right? So at two, it went down, and then at six group members, it went way down because again we have all this overlapping in our responsibilities, and we're not effective, we're not efficient, and we're not doing work and not producing at a higher level. Okay? So how do we make decisions in groups? We talked about productivity. We talked about how we behave, but how do we make decisions? Okay. One of the different phenomena that we talk about in making decisions and group making decisions is group polarization, right? And this phenomena occurs when we have group discussions, and it either strengthens or weakens the group's group viewpoint of a particular decision, right? So we start off kind of moderately in the beginning, in this example here, we're kind of neutral here, right? And many people are leaning towards the negative, right? And then after some discussion, after some dialogue, everybody kind of shifts more towards the negative, right? And that happens with group polarization. It doesn't mean that we have, half the group going one way and half the group going the other. If we have individuals who are kind of moderately uh, against certain things, then we can, with a discussion, get them to shift toward a more extreme decision in that direction, right? It happens in either direction, right? Because of the discussion, um, again, that group's dominant viewpoint produces a shift toward a more extreme decision. And it happens all the time, right? You have a group of individuals, like I talked about before, deciding on where they're going to go for vacation, right? Or where they're going to go for their retreat, right? You got some people who want to go to Tennessee, and then you have about two people who want to go to Florida, right? After some discussion, they talk through some of the pros and the cons. They have some content, some logic behind why they think they should go to Tennessee. Then those who say they wanted to go to Florida, they move over closer to making a decision to go to Tennessee for their corporate retreat. Right? It happens naturally as we interact with people in making decisions. Okay? There are some pros and some cons to decision making and why we make decisions the way we do. Right? One of the processes that we do and make is what we call groupthink. Groupthink it's a negative thing, right? When you have people that are groupthink, that means they're falling in the same train of thought, right? There's no diversity of thought, and when you don't have diversity of thought, you lose out on a lot of creativity. You lose out on great perspectives when everyone's thinking the same. So this is again the process which members of a really cohesive group emphasize concurrence at the expense of critical thinking, right? in arriving at a decision, right? So everybody's thinking the same thing and you're not able to see other person's viewpoints, then you come at a decision that might not be the best decision, right? Groupthink also promotes confirmation bias. So I'm always going to think about and reject things that don't kind of come into an alignment with how I think and how I believe, right? So I'm going to reject those things that don't align with what I believe, and I'm going to go with those things that do, right? So even with people, right? Somebody new comes into the group and they come in with a new perspective. If they don't come in with the same perspective, I reject their viewpoint. I try to get them and persuade them to join in on the way we think. Okay. A key precondition to groupthink is high group cohesiveness. Right. So if the group is really, really cohesive, really, really together, they value each other's opinion, they respect each other, and they work well together, then you're going to have high group cohesiveness. And when you have high group cohesiveness, groupthink is almost sometimes inevitable, right? Group cohesiveness, again, is a liking relationship, right? It links members of the group together, and it kind of builds this camaraderie in the group. Other factors that may lead to groupthink is relative isolation, power structure of the group, and quickness of the decision, right? So relative isolation, if the group is kind of relatively isolated off to the side and they're not really engaging with other groups, then that relative isolation keeps their thought process kind of isolated in one group, right? And so they just start thinking like one another because they don't and can't see other viewpoints, right? The power structure of the group. If you have a really, really strong and dominant leader that leads in a really authoritarian way, then it's really, really difficult to have kind of diversity of thought. They're leading the group to think a certain way. And then the quickness of decision, right? If you have to make the decision really, really quickly, people are just going to give up the critical thinking to just go along with what the group's thinking, right? Aside from, trying to weigh the options. We don't have time to weigh the options, right? So I just go with what the group thinks. So as a knowledge check, it says, when is groupthink more likely to occur? It says when there is A, little group cohesiveness, B, when the group works in relative isolation, C, when there is no clear group leader, D, when significant time is given for the decision-making process. Out of the process of elimination, you can think like if you have more time, you should be able to use more critical thinking skills to make decisions. When there is little group cohesiveness, right, that means there is less groupthink, right? And then when group works and when there is no clear group leader, right, we talked about having a strong and dominant leader, right? But if you have a strong group leader, then groupthink is almost inevitable. Okay. The answer you should have selected would have been B. Okay. Again, when a group works in relative isolation, they're kind of off to the side and they don't interact with other people and they're kind of isolated, right? Then they become, it's just like cults. That's why cult leaders, they isolate they isolate their followers so that they can't see any other point of view. They only see the leader's point of view. That's why cults have been that's why the cults are so effective, right? Because again, they're isolated. They isolate them. They cut off their family. They cut off their friends. Everybody in their group is isolated, and they have one big dominant leader who's telling them what to think, what to do, and what to believe. All right, that's all we have for this chapter. When we talk about the unifying themes, right? Just think about again psychology in and of itself. Extremely empirical. We talked about the obedience authority, the Milgrams. We talked about the Solomon Asch, his research, the bystander effect. All of these things are observed through empiricism and numbers and empirical data. Right? Behavior is shaped by cultural heritage. Right? We saw some cross-cultural studies. Collectivism versus being individualistic, right? All of that plays a role in how we respond, how we behave in social settings. Behavior is obviously determined by multiple causes. So our perception, our interpersonal attraction, our persuasion to certain things, all of those things are again formed by maybe the group, maybe our attitudes, our personal attitudes. All of that influences how we how we think. And then lastly, our experience of the world is extremely subjective. The way we respond in certain situations is going to be very based on our personal experiences, right? The way we were brought up, our culture, our belief system, our attitudes, the way we view people, like the physical appearance can influence our perception, right? I might find someone attractive that you may not, just based on, again, my personal preferences. Okay? And we'll stop right there. Again, this is chapter 12, social behavior, part 2. We'll see you next time.